I'm an assistant professor in advertising.
So Eva and I have worked a lot across different projects, and today we're going to be talking about some of our shared perspectives on the intersection between computer science and advertising, which we call computational advertising. So let's start with the beginning. I want to give a brief high-level perspective on what computational advertising is for many of you who may not be familiar with what this entails. So as you might know, that advertising has a storied history, right? It functions really, it is a really important function, both in sales as well as branding of products. When you look at a print ad, so this is a Charles Schwab print ad, everyone subscribes to this magazine will see the same print ad, okay? Exactly the same print ad. However, online, something very interesting happens. So when you visit the New York Times, for example, as I did some time back, Charles Schwab presented an ad to me. This ad was not an accident. It was targeted at me. And so online advertising thrives on presenting ads that are targeted towards specific individuals. The computational side of it is that by the time you load a web page, the ad that is shown to you, the targeting of the ad, the auction that is run to figure out who actually ends up showing that ad, all of that has a time guarantee of having to be done in less than 100 seconds. This is an incredible computational aspect of this process. And so this is largely partly what happens at the computational side of advertising. So at a very high level, this is the process. You might have a bunch of advertisers. They visit an ad exchange, and this ad exchange runs an auction. Sometimes the publisher runs their own auction. Sometimes Google runs the auction for them. Yeah. So you'll have a publisher who might have a space, and that says, and this person, the publisher says, this space is available for somebody to display their ad. People say, okay, who's shown up? So, for example, if I visit the New York Times, somebody might say that, hey, Hari has visited the New York Times. Who wants to show him an ad? So one of these car manufacturers decides that Hari is in the market for a car right now. We need to be part of this auction, and we will make a bid, and the person with the highest bidder will win the auction. Okay. So, so here's a synopsis of computational advertising infrastructure. So what is the infrastructure about? So step one, it all began when Google decided to monetize web search, right? So web search was the basis of how advertising in its modern incarnation began. In the early 1990s, there were a lot of, in the early days of the web, people were very much concerned with advertising and they had display ads. But Google was the first entity that really figured out how to monetize advertising for its business model. So there's all this work on web search that happened. Then Google said, okay, how do we get better ads? So they created all these different algorithms for query rewriting. So if you search for a car, they will simultaneously execute searches for sedans, family wagons, SUVs, and so on simultaneously. And they will execute all these related searches and aggregate the results for you. And all those different searches are simultaneously bid on by different advertisers. Okay. There's also an algorithm called Sundaram that's used to identify better ads. All right, so you have a whole bunch of advertisers who are interested in showing me ads. How do they figure out who wins and who decides and which ads and how are these advertisers compensate Google? The framework by which this works is game theory, and specifically what we use from game theory is this idea of auctions. Today, there are hundreds of millions of auctions that are happening in real time. The winners of these auctions decide, get to display the ads to me, whether it happens in search or whether you go to a publisher website. The price that they pay depends upon the kind of auction that is being run. Okay. So another aspect of computational advertising infrastructure is coming from recommender systems. And a lot of ideas from recommender systems are used to figure out which ad to show. So for example, if I click on a lot of ads that are related to, say, cars, complementary products related to cars may show up. Okay. as relevant ads. So in digital ads are all over the place. They happen in apps. They appear on websites. Okay. Again, with respect, depending upon where you are, you may have questions like, do we have a long-term contract? So if you're a publisher, let's say BMW, and you say, okay, I want to show a lot of ads on ESPN.com because that's where my target audience is. What does BMW do? Should they negotiate a long-term contract with ESPN? Or do they say, hey, you know what? I'm going to participate in an auction every single time a person shows up. The trade-offs are that in an auction, prices can fluctuate, but if you set up a contract ahead of time, you're guaranteed delivery of your ads. Okay. Then computational advertising involves techniques for behavioral targeting, identifying the right set of behaviors that are relevant for a particular advertiser. You also have word of mouth advertising or viral marketing, that's part of computational advertising. And finally, you have to ask, if everybody is bidding on me when I show up at the New York Times website, how do they know who I am? Right? In order to make advertising work, there is a massive infrastructure that tracks my behavior as I wander across different websites and as I use different mobile apps, right? Massive computational infrastructure. So one disarming, alarming aspect of this is that it leads to this what's called surveillance at a massive scale. As you saw in the Cambridge Analytica scandal on Facebook, this architecture, infrastructure that is primarily used for advertising, can be misused to manipulate opinion. And you can also think about, okay, this, and there are nascent entrepreneurial ventures on this, on markets for data. If my behavior is so valuable, why can't I auction it myself? Why is somebody else walking into my house, tracking me, selling my data to Google, and Google is using that as the basis of its decision? Instead, why can't I price my data? Maybe my data is worth $10,000 to me. Okay, so there are emerging markets for data, and there are problems with the way in which it's set up, but that's a different issue. And then the other thing that researchers do is that we conduct audits of these markets and connect it with the legal landscape to identify weaknesses and challenges in the way in which these computational markets, these advertising markets are run. Okay, so this is a very high-level view of the computational side of things.
I would just add to that. This is all true. We keep talking about websites, right? But of course, it's right now the ecosystem also includes streaming services, right? Whether it's music, movies, also digital out of home, so all the billboards that are digital. And all of that can be purchased and sold programmatically and auctions. And also the interesting, something that I find interesting is like when Harry talks about bad actors, we usually think about companies like data management platforms like Cambridge Analytica, but it can be also people, right? So we've had so many cases, like there was a case when a few teenagers from one of the Southern Central European countries created a website to capitalize on advertising, and they clicked on the ads, but actually this were fraudulent clicks, right, just to make money. And of course, there's our behavior. So we as consumers, we try to protect ourselves, which we have right to do, but sometimes we also try to engage in these behaviors that are maybe not necessarily ethical, like also create clicks that are not legal, right? So we have tools like plugins, and people develop plugins to not only protect themselves from advertising, data harvesting, but also to punish advertisers for advertising to us.
So I want to just add on to that, and before we get to two important aspects of our talk, I want to zoom out a little bit, and apologies, I should have said that randomly. Why does any of this discussion matter, right? If you think about purely from the perspective of revenue, 97% of Facebook's revenue comes from advertising. 88% of Alphabet's revenue comes from advertising. When Google talks about all of its products, including search and email and so on, and the secret futuristic projects and so on. The thing that they don't talk about is advertising. Advertising funnels or helps us say almost all of our current internet ecosystem. All the revenues indirectly or directly come from them. Now, so many of the things that Emma and I are going to be talking about are problems, and they need to be addressed because advertising as a conception is a really important part of our culture. So it's the way in which corporations speak to consumers about their products. However, the infrastructure that we have in place today is deeply problematic for a lot of different reasons. Okay, and it's difficult to change it because there are actors in it who make money off it who don't want it to change, right? So those are the two different dimensions that I want you to keep track of. And it's a really important aspect of how corporations attract consumers, is the infrastructure that needs to change. Okay? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about persuasion, and let's talk with this provocative question: what might advertising look like 100 years from now? Okay? So it's possible that one of the ways in which advertising might happen is that we might end up auctioning our attention at an individual level. So today, when we think of auctions, auctions happen for space on websites. They happen for space on Google, where search ads show up. Nobody asks me, what do I want to see? But it's my attention that you're asking for right now. But you're not asking me what I want. It's like saying that, I have $10 for lunch, and I'll give that money to somebody who gives me lunch for the cheapest price. That's crazy, right? I might be vegetarian. I'm not in the mood for eating a hot dog right now if you give it to me for 99 cents. You want to auction attention at the level of one person. But how's that going to happen?
Yeah, and we're not there yet, obviously, we're talking about 2,122. But there are people working on it, right? So some of you may have been using Brave, for example, as a browser, right? And it does allow you as a user to at least decide whether you want to be exposed to ads and then get kind of paid for that in their own cryptocurrency for now, right? And there are not many brands. So I've been using it for like more than a year now. And I have to say that at the beginning it was mostly cryptocurrency companies. Now I see companies like Chipotle. So, there is some resistance in the brands don't necessarily want to jump into that yet, but there are efforts being made to do that. And there's also lots of work in like blockchain technology, which I know very little about, much less than you do probably. But also the idea is that you have to introduce more control over our data and our attention so that we can decide, let's say, I don't want to see political advertising at all, right? But I'm willing to see ads about cars because I want to buy a new one. So that would give me like an opportunity to really decide and return my agency to me. So I can really decide with whom, with what kinds of companies I want to share my information with.
But wouldn't that go against the whole idea of advertising in the sense of a lot of advertising is convincing you, or even giving you things that you don't know you want? So if I ask you, you don't know what you want. So how can I give you something you don't know?
So, but that is true in a way that we would like to, this is when it comes to building awareness. So maybe people don't know yet that they, certain products, like if you think about, remember that you're too young, but at a certain point, companies introduced toothbrushes with tongue brushes, which was a thing that people do I really need it, right? Probably you wouldn't think about it because it didn't exist. So they had to create that need first and then awareness. However, most of the advertising that we see that's auctioned, it's actually behavioral targeted, so based on our previous behaviors. And quite often, surprisingly, it's actually irrelevant. So when even though the premise is we want to show you relevant ads which are based on your clicking behaviors and your interactions with social media, interactions with other types of content, especially digital content. In the end, when we ask people in surveys, do you get relevant ads? They say no. Mostly because probably the technology is not yet there when it comes to really predicting what people may want, but they don't know that they want it. So far we've been mostly working with data that tell us, oh, you are in the market for a new car, which is, and in the end you may have bought it, but you still get these ads for the car.
So you asked a really good question about this tension between whether a person understands what they want and what they should be told, right? It's possible that a person could say that, look, most of the time, these are the kinds of things I'm interested in now. But maybe 10% of the time surprise me with things that you think that I should know. But I should have the agency to decide how the degree of surprise that I want to have. If I'm in the market for a bicycle, I don't want you to bother me with anything else, right? But surprise me once in a while. So, but it's a great question.
Yeah. And that's what kind of like we recommend the systems are going, I think, some of them, like to introduce that serendipity, that you see something that's, oh, this is surprising, or maybe something I didn't realize that I might be interested in. But I think we see that more in content, like movies and music, a little bit less in products, and less in news, even though there's some push towards that.
Yeah.
So actually, I mean, this question, reminded me of this, like, if you think of this computational, advertising ecosystem as you described, this infrastructure essentially lets us do performance marketing, right? The appeal of it for marketers is that we target and we measure the outcomes very precisely.
Precisely.
Or that's the promise, right?
That's the promise, yeah. That you can measure all the clicks.
Measure all the clicks. But then sort of, as you started with talking about, advertising has a storied history. So one of the criticisms is that this computational advertising, ecosystem does not really contribute to building brands, which actually, so what Eva said about, creating a need and or the question that, does it really help build awareness, create needs? So it reminded me of that tension. So I would, be very keen to hear your take on this idea that this infrastructure is very good for measuring the performance of campaigns that are very precisely targeted to a certain extent, but it really doesn't replace the, ways traditional advertising actually built brands with stories.
It's a great point, right? I think it's this notion also that and I'm not an advertising person, but I understand some of the infrastructure. But one of the questions that I have to you guys is that, is it possible that brands only appear as part of a common shared culture that is no longer present today because our attention is so completely fragmented? Because each one of us sees a curated media stream for us, whether it's the news, whether it's website, Netflix, Amazon, wherever you consume media, we see something that's been curated for us. So if you can't construct a shared cultural consciousness about an idea, is it possible for you to create branding effectively as you did in the print and radio and TV age, when everybody saw the same program, when everybody probably read the same subset of magazines? So that it's possible that it's difficult to do that even more so because of the fragmentation of attention. I don't know if it's necessarily the cause of, if it's necessarily a computational advertising infrastructure issue, but the notion of how culture is getting fragmented the way it is.
I would say it can help you with branding efforts, but it's not going to replace all the other things that you have to do to establish a brand, right? So all the PR stuff, all the events, all the traditional advertising that you still need to do. It can help with it and speed up the process a little bit, maybe. But there's still that's something that we discussed, I think, last week. We still need humans in this process.
Well, definitely to follow. Right. Yes.
I think there was another question.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm curious to know if you think that advertising can be optimized in a way that can guarantee a click, or if there's too many human factors, no matter what's optimized to make that happen.
So why don't you have a I want to think about what you're saying.
So while we don't know the algorithms that are being used to predict whether someone's going to click or not, we know that there is many features that go into that algorithm, including personal characteristics of the person in front of the screen, and how he's searching for a car, but also the ad itself, right? So what kind of characteristic, how interesting it is, relevant quality, creative quality, all these things. Of course, the bid, but also the landing page. So there's like a very long list of features that go into the prediction model. I would say I would never guarantee anything. And looking also at like the data that we have, mostly we see that advertising effects are actually quite, what's the best word for that? Small. Yes. They're not huge, right? So I would, even though we optimize for that click quite often, like companies do that, they usually don't focus on these long-term effects, so that would be more branding. They focus on that click, indeed. But I don't think any company, even Google, that has very sophisticated algorithms, wouldn't guarantee it.
So Evan, going back to your point about the click, right? So I think it's important not to forget the infrastructure, how this happens, the way in which this happens. So imagine you have a bunch of advertisers interested in showing me an ad. Right now, there will be a space, say on a particular publisher website like ESPN.com, and there will be an option, right? Each one of them has a certain private utility in me seeing their ad. So one important question that is in some sense unanswered right now is, how are they so sure of what they know about me, that their bids reflect their knowledge of me? Right now, it looks like right now it's possible that their bids are not well informed. So it's not so much about optimization, the click in terms of seeing the asset itself. It's like I may be seeing the wrong ad from the start. Yeah. So, and I'll come back to this maybe toward the end, but let's walk through. So today the focus is on identifying programmatic advertising, but the right audience for the ad for the appropriate time and location. The next step is for the asset to be synthesized in real time, personalized, and shown at the appropriate place and time. Yeah. So for example, so if you look at this.
Hello, diverges in the desert. Alexis. Hello,
Some of you have already seen this movie, right? So it's this is an iconic scene in terms of computational advertising, but this has already happened, even though this is set in 2024, right? So you often have Bluetooth-based trackers that can show you the ad in a kiosk in the mall based upon who you are, right? So this has already been done, but what has not been done is to adapt the creative asset to you in real time. And that is, I think, an interesting question for computational advertising. So, for example, a core research question that Evan and I worked together on is, how do we design algorithms that result in a persuasive creative asset? So, Evan, do you want to talk about what persuasion is? And yeah,
real quick, how would you define a persuasive creative asset?
that's exactly what.
That's
Evan
a very good question. That's something that we've been struggling with as well. Because when you look at the literature on persuasion, it's like many books and many articles, and there are so many different factors that affect whether someone is persuaded. And and it's been an experience for me as well, because we published papers about persuasion, but then Harry asked me like, "But what's persuasion?" I'm like, what? We never think about it. It's like you change your attitude towards an object, right? Or you change your behavior. So I may persuade you to go to your classes regularly and never miss a class, or I can persuade you to really like a certain thing, right? But there's so many dimensions of persuasion, and certain dimensions are easier to influence, right? Like maybe attitude, but then others like actual behavior, much more difficult, right? And then that depends on many other factors, like your own personality, but also how difficult that behavior is, for example. What we also we found, for example, in one study that's pretty easy to persuade people to click on a social media ad. But then when we ask them whether they would be willing to share it, or like whether they would actually buy it and they would like to go to a website, they're like, no, right? So certain behaviors are easier to shift.
So, one of the things, just to build on what Eva is saying, is that actually one of the weaknesses in research in computer science is that computer science research, when we think about persuasion, if you look at all the papers that have been published, it's typically about changing behavior. And that is, if you talk to Eva and you talk to other people who have a background in this, it's really 4 stages. You have attitude, you have beliefs, you have attitude, you have intentions, and then behavior. So, you can't suddenly ask somebody to drive before they know how to read, right? So you need to get, so one of the things that we need to understand better is when you say persuasion, what dimension of persuasion are you actually affecting? And that's something that we are trying to understand better today, yeah, in our work together. So this is work that students are working together with us on. And so this is a question of, can we synthesize persuasive text given a prompt? So given a prompt, can we use a deep neural model to generate? I'm going to give you, since Garima asked me to say something technical, I have to go through this. I'm going to put something technical on the slide to walk you through this. So imagine if you have a computational framework that takes 2 sentences and is able to decide, give a score of which one is more persuasive, right? And so this alpha S is the degree of contrast. If alpha S is +1, that means the YS star was strongly more persuasive than the reference. If alpha S is 0.1, close to 0, but just positive, it's just slightly more persuasive. So you should think of it as a degree of contrast, okay? So now you train what's called train a discriminator. That's your first step. In the second step, so imagine you're given a prompt that says plastic bottles are bad because you take your ground truth label and then you ask, I have a complicated neural language model that produces sentences. Given a sentence that's persuasive, what does my current model think of it? How likely was this so-called persuasive sentence be generated by my current language model? So it scores it. It says, you know what, not very likely to have generated it. Okay, so that is a loss term called the reconstruction loss. It says, if you give me a persuasive sentence, how likely will a sophisticated language model have generated it? And we use a particular language model. And then we ask the language model to generate a sentence. That's Y. And then we ask our persuasive score, the same model. Okay, you got something from your complex neural model. Do you think it's persuasive? It'll give me another score, and that's L of D. Okay, that's the discriminator loss. And so you combine all of these to construct this overall loss, which is a combination of how good are neural models at synthesizing persuasive sentences. What does it think of a current persuasive sentence? And given what it constructs, how good is it? So you can use these 2 numbers to fine-tune your deep neural language model so that you can train it to create more persuasive or more memorable sentences. Okay, to give you an idea of what happens, the prompt is plastic water bottles are bad. Okay, T-stylist is the state-of-the-art neural model at synthesis. So that's what that does. So you can see what it generates. It says plastic water bottles are bad because plastic water bottles are bad for our environment. This is our synthesis, and it's a little bit more reasonable. Okay, I would say it's definitely more persuasive than the other one, but is it absolutely persuasive? Is it going to prevent you from ever picking up a plastic water bottle? Hard to know. Okay, but it's definitely a much more amenable sentence to being called persuasive. Okay, yeah.
Can I use this somewhere? Is it on GitHub or somewhere, or?
So once the paper gets accepted, we'll publish the book, but it's under review right now. Okay, but hopefully so. Okay, so that's that. So what next? So this is, so some of you may already know about DALI, which is this zero-shot text-to-image generation program. So basically, it means that you give it a prompt, and it spits out an image based upon a deep neural model. Okay. The other thing that you can do is you can synthesize videos. So you can make it conditional. So this is what you could do. You could make it conditional on gender, ethnicity, and scenario, and it synthesizes a full-blown video. As you can imagine, you can potentially combine ideas from DALL-E 2 and this video GPT to give a text prompt, and for the video to actually be synthesized automatically. Okay, so it's not infeasible that actually happens. Now, of course, there are very clear ethical and moral issues associated with this, because it's possible that the videos that are produced are harmful, they're hurtful, they are disrespectful of certain identities. It's extremely difficult to control for it. Right now, what we creators of DALL-E have done is that they have restricted the set of imagery and text that are associated between these sets of words and images. Okay, but it's very easy to see that if they release their code in public, some other people may not be so fine. Okay, so this is very complicated and problematic, but this is going to happen. It's not a question of me not wanting to see it happen. This is inevitable. The question is, we as researchers, what is our ethical perspective on questions like this? How do we shape the discussion so that the resulting outcomes are ethical and fair? Right? That is our job. Our job can't be to say that this needs to be stopped because somebody else is going to stop to do this work. Yeah.
Just to stress Harry's point that this is going to happen. Like if you look at what's our interactions with chatbots, right, or the robocalls, which are increasingly natural, right, and sometimes we don't know that there is actually not a human being talking to us. And now that leads to lots of ethical implications as well. Like, should we disclose that? Because we know that it affects how people react to that conversation. So there are disadvantages for advertisers. We also see where we don't have like programmatic creative, so we don't have this synthesis happening within those 100 milliseconds. We do have some creative optimization. So we will have like advertisers will produce a number of templates which are going to mix and match depending on who's their audience, right? And we do see like advertisers using a little bit of image generation already, and the deepfake videos kind of being used now for advertising to create representatives of the brands who can speak, automate, synthesize and speak different languages and communicate with consumers. So it is happening, right? It's just we're not there yet, but
yeah, it's not plug and play, but the pieces of the puzzle are slowly coming into the fold. So here's a provocative question for you: is it possible that personalization could be counterproductive? So is it possible that, for example, let's say this, the hyper-realistic John Anderton type scenario is here, and I'm walking down a mall, and every single ad that I see projected on the wall is speaking to me. It's speaking to my ethnicity, it's speaking to my identity, my age. Why do I want to see all these stories about me, right? So, if you think about the function of art in our lives, in terms of literature and movies and music, a lot of it is not personalized. A lot of it is about telling stories that excite our imagination, that make us sometimes re-examine the world in which we live and ask interesting and important questions. So it's possible deep personalization with automated image and video synthesis and auditory synthesis may actually backfire. I may not want to be part of that work. Again, something to think about. So this is something that Eva and I are exploring in a different project, that what if we do the opposite and completely depersonalize it and make representations completely abstract? That is, you cannot actually identify any feature that you see in the image with a human being. Would that work for persuasion? Yeah. Okay. So.
yeah, I forgot that. And we did see like lots of more and more consumers talking about like creepiness, for example. Sometimes they don't want to see those personalized messages that Harry mentioned. And we do see that they want to be treated like human beings, right? So people want one-on-one communication, but also they want it to be sincere and human and empathetic. So how can we do that when we're generating messages with AI, right? In the future, maybe it's possible, but people want to interact with people. They don't want to interact with machines. Right? That's a big challenge, I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you guys earlier talked about like having like the consumer being able to preference like certain things that they want out of their advertising, or like to have like a 10% surprise me. Do you see something like this and like the idea of potentially having that room for imagination be productive within that space of that like 10% surprise me?
It's possible, but it's one of the things that we're not going to talk about today is that we think about advertising as passive consumption, right? Like even in the John Anderson video that he's being shown all these videos. But what if construct a different scenario where you can ask questions of the ad, right? After all, many of these ads are going to be powered in the future by extraordinarily powerful algorithms. I could have a real-time communication with the characters in the ad saying, me, look, I'm all for this car, but I like to drive stick. You have a model that is available in stick, and if so, how much does it cost? We can't have this two-way communication right now, right? So it's possible we can have a different conception of how even the consumption of brands and consumption of specific products takes place. So that doesn't exist today, right? Or you could ask questions like, if I apply for a loan for this car, will I be discriminated because of my identity? Tell me statistics. So these are difficult questions, but that's where we could go towards, right? A conversation rather than consumption.
And another obstacle that we see today, which I was actually surprised to see, so when we talked about it with Harry, I was like, why is Google so against it? So it seems that Google, it's against the rules for Google at least to use some kind of automation in content generation. And for them, whether it's AI, but actually I looked into that again, and even if it's machine learning, so very basic stuff, they say it's automation and it's against the rules. Now, there's no clear explanation why it's against the rules. And the difficulty is that the generated ads, especially search ads, are so good at this point that it's difficult for Google to recognize which are AI generated. So they need some human supervision over that process. So I think some of it may be AI generated, just is not recognized by Google during the screening.
It's possible that there are also legal concerns, right? Yeah. So if you run an automated algorithm that's producing ads, what if the imagery or the text is hurtful? Google is not interested in some sense protecting the corporation, but it's protecting its own interests. It's possible that its brand gets hurt. It's possible that it's liable because suddenly there's hateful imagery in terms of the ad that's automatically generated. Somebody wrote the code to create it, right? But Google is the provider of that advertising, so it might be liable. So this is one last connection. So if you see an ad, can we prove that alone was the reason for you to make a purchase, right? So making causal claims like this, that I saw this ad and therefore I went to that website, is extremely hard. And it's part of this work, long history of work in AI called causal reasoning and causal inference. So if you're interested in these kinds of questions, that could be something that you could explore. And this particular issue is all the more salient today because this was in March, Apple pushed an update to iOS that made it extremely hard for third parties to track what people do outside of their app. So you might say, okay, who cares about this, right? Huge problem for platforms like TikTok, Snap, Facebook. Why? They can no longer tell their advertisers that, hey, Hari went to your website after he saw the ad on my platform. Even if I went to that website immediately after, there's no way in which they can do this attribution without tracking. So this has caused a huge revenue loss in all these social media platforms that rely on advertising.
I would say that attribution modeling is like the holy grail now of advertising.
Yeah.
How you can really talk about causal effects here. Right? It's very difficult.
Okay, so let's switch gears to privacy and see if you have time to go through it, but we'll try. Okay. So the success of personalization rests on a fundamental issue in computational advertising, which is tracking of individual behavior. Because we don't give away data about ourselves for free. It's inferred from our behavior, right? So, for example, when I recently visited this clothing store, I saw people who were people of color who were largely modeling the clothes. Very few people who were Caucasian who showed up. They were typically Asian or people of color. The question is, how did they know who I was? Right? It's disturbing. I didn't tell them, but how did they know who I was? At the same time, I was happy because then I could see whether how the clothes might look on me if I actually brought them home. It was definitely beneficial, but it still was problematic to me that they did this without asking me. Okay. So we have very little understanding of what data is collected, how it's transacted, and what the value is.
And in addition to that, we are often told by all these companies, don't worry because we only store like anonymous data about you, right? There is not going to be any personally identifiable information. Now, there's so many studies right now all over the world actually dealing with the identification of individuals in data sets. And even some of you may be familiar with the Netflix challenge, where the different groups are working on recommendation system to improve the algorithms and win $1 million. Then other researchers took the data set to actually merge it with other publicly available data sets and re-identify the users who were in that Netflix data set. And they were successful at doing that. So the problem is quite often that even like we have this false sense of security when we're online or when we interact with brands. And consumers often don't know that the information can be de-anonymized.
Okay, so there's an information asymmetry here that results in loss of power, okay, the corporations that track and analyze the data.
And also, we are participating, whether we want it or not, we keep participating in experiments, right? So you may have heard about the recent experiment on LinkedIn. There were like other experiments previously on Facebook, but actually you go to Expedia or Booking.com to book your spring break adventure and you're being experimented on as well. Amazon runs like so many A/B tests, right, a day. All these different big companies, they run testing on us. And maybe it is somewhere in the terms of conditions. If you manage to go through all the terms and conditions and actually find it there. But even if you do, and most of the people don't, there's no way to like most of the companies, but most of the companies don't allow us to opt out of the experiment. So they just assume that we provide the consent to participate, but there's no explicit consent. So there's no one, as Harry mentioned when we talked about it, there's no like overview over the ethics of this experiment. So there was actually a lawsuit in Australia that I was supposed to participate in, where they were testing, when you go to a booking website, whether it's flights or hotels, and then there's that red font saying, oh, there's only one left. This is manipulative, right? And it does work because of our psychological biases. And that lawsuit was like, this company shouldn't be doing that or should be telling people that they're engaging in such practices. So we don't have these regulations, and again, there's no oversight over who's doing what kind of manipulations. And another aspect that I'm also kind of interested in from like business and the ecosystem perspective is that the data collection, which is like harvesting all that information about us, leads us to the establishment of digital divides. So now we have companies that are very data rich, especially the walled gardens, so the companies that close us in that ecosystem where we use all the connected devices and websites and apps. So they know everything about us without even the need to gather data or like ask us for our information. And then we have data poor companies, which may be especially smaller companies, startups, right? It's maybe much more difficult for them to compete with these huge companies because they just don't know, they don't know enough about the consumers and they cannot really optimize for that click because they don't have the information for that.
So if your personalized targeting advertising could run afoul of the law. So let me just give you a brief primer here. So titles 7 and 8 of the Landmark Civil Rights Act guarantee equal employment and housing opportunities regardless of sex, race, sex, and other protected categories. Right? So for example, in employment, it says it shall be unlawful for any employment agency, joint labor management committee, publish any advertisement relating to employment indicating any preference based on sex. Title 8 housing shall be unlawful to publish any advertisement. So the big difference between Title 7 and 8 is who. Title 8, it doesn't really matter who you are. You cannot publish an ad that violates our civil rights in advertising, right? This is huge. Now, so determining who is liable in the computational advertising infrastructure is extremely complicated and challenging. So we have shown in both employment ads and in housing ads, there is some covariation in the ads that are being shown with respect to, in the case of housing with race, in the case of employment based on gender, right? So this is deeply troubling. But who's responsible? Is it Google? Is it the advertiser? Is it the market demand at that point? It's not very clear. So this is a study that I've done, I mean, that's under review right now, but the results are quite startling. It turns out that if you go down Kayak, if you buy tickets, not in incognito, for some sellers, there's a 94% chance that you'll be shown the higher price, just based on your browsing behavior. Okay, and this is absolutely crazy because it's like, so if you want to consider how crazy this is, imagine you go to a cafe and you buy your favorite brew of coffee. Let's say it's a cappuccino, right? You buy that and you pay $5. The person who comes just after you and buys exactly the same exact drink pays $4. You're like, wait, how is that possible? I paid $5, he paid $4. Today, you can't go to a cafe and for the barista to charge you different prices. And the reason for that is that the price is on the wall. In physical markets, are price transparent. Everybody knows what they're buying. Online, our entire world is curated, it's personalized. So which means that the same seller could be showing me the same identical good at the same time to someone else and charging us different prices based on willingness to pay. And this willingness to pay could just vary based upon your gender, your race, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, could be any of these protected attributes. And that is immensely troubling. Yeah. So just want to, okay, let me go forward because you have your next presentation. So let's zoom
It's okay.
forward.
It's okay. We're good on time. We're good on time.
Okay, let me come here. Okay, this is our final slide. So what Eva and I believe that advertising can be a critical part of corporations' efforts to reach consumers. Okay, but there are many exciting and difficult research challenges that lie ahead in creating an ethical, fair, computational ad ecosystem. Okay, so for many of you who are undergrads, there are lots of opportunities for you to engage in research. Okay. Or you can take advantages of, in some sense, the market need, the desire for privacy, anonymity, and what the market is providing, and perhaps start a new entrepreneurial venture, okay, to address that need. Or you could work with NGOs or with branches of government who are interested in questions of ethics in this technological age, and think about how you can help with that. Okay, there are many different ways of getting involved in this exciting area. So, thank you.